As the PLAN Marines of the PLAN 1st Marine Brigade stormed ashore and began to capture the port facilities intact to be able to thereby use the cranes and other port equipment to offload their heavier elements of their brigade, as in their heavier battalions that were out on their specialized cargo ships that would be offloaded rapidly and easily using the captured port equipment. Also, the oil facilities in the form of the refineries were captured relatively intact, as the bridgehead of the PLAN Marines had expanded rapidly, as more and more of the reconnaissance battalion's companies were landed using the LCACs to ferry them ashore, as well as also the air assault battalion dropping off more and more of their troops and circling above with their Z-9 WA attack helicopters to provide steady and constant air support. As the defenses were relatively light along the coast due to a combination of issues with the Navy suffering budget cuts, which ended up leaving many of their vessels moored away in port, with a small contingent still patrolling the littoral areas to defend them from any possible enemy strikes, which was, in the American mind, unthinkable, as they thought that the worst that could happen if the drills went hot would be some kind of small-scale limited strikes, not a full-scale fourth-generation warfare doctrine invasion, which was completely turning warfare on its head, as this was the newest and most advanced means of waging war, using Trojan shock forces to infiltrate the target nation, building up one's logistics within and around the target nation, and then striking with everything the attacking nation possessed in terms of all their new innovative tech, and integrating that into the means of warfare being waged, with the Trojans taking center stage, doing all of the heavy lifting, with the externals taking a backseat and becoming their heavy-handed reinforcements, as opposed to the main proverbial stars of the show, where they cross the borders and do all of the fighting. With the Trojan shock armies taking center stage, it would be they who would be capturing all of their key objectives, many of these forces beginning within mere miles of their objectives, and in some cases, horrifyingly adjacent to them. With the externals becoming the heavy-handed reinforcements of the Trojan shock forces, who would capture key nodes along their invasion routes to allow for them to cross the borders and rapidly move inland unopposed, or minimally opposed at the very most. The Trojans would also be capturing all their key objectives or destroying them, as everything played a role in terms of the forces involved. From the highest level all the way to the lowest level, all forces had their own objectives, and each unit was like a jigsaw puzzle piece with their own objectives to be fulfilled, coming together to make a much greater picture of a larger scale operation, with many cogs and wheels and moving pieces at the very smallest levels doing their own parts when it came to their objectives and fulfilling them. As all of the forces in the Houston battle, whether it was the People's Armed Police shock forces, which were busy smashing their way into this city from the outside of it, or whether it was the PLA and their very powerful forces in the form of the 83rd PLA Group Army and their latest and greatest in military weaponry and technology, or whether it was the PLAN's naval vessels, or the Strategic Missile Forces, or the Russian VVS, or their Air Force, and the PLAAF, conducting tactical air raids, precision strikes, or strategic air raids in the form of the heavy strategic bomber aircraft, and even utilizing those aircraft in a tactical role to actually use them to carpet munition enemy units on the field. As the PLA forces, in terms of their armored elements, were equipped with either the Type 96B or within the heavy combined arms brigades like the 131st, for instance, and the 11th, they were equipped with the Type 99A, potentially the most advanced main battle tank in the world, with the Type 96 not very far behind it. There was also new air defense systems, both SHORAD and longer range, such as the Type 625E, which equipped the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade's SHORAD battalion. One of two was equipped with the Type 625E, which was anti-drone and short-range air defense in general terms, as well as also the LD-35 equipping another of the two SHORAD battalions, with the HQ-16, which had proven its worth time and time again when training, equipping the mid-range air defense battalions, of which there was two within the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and the brand new HQ-22 longer range surface-to-air missile systems equipping their two long-range air defense artillery battalions, which essentially, as the 83rd was the 83rd Group Army's Air Defense Brigade, they provided a layer of cover to their troops with integrated air defense from the lowest, most close-range levels, as in lowest altitude and close-in range, to the highest altitude with the HQ-22s. They also had newer radar systems as well, such as the vaunted anti-stealth radars that equipped all of the different branches of the PLA, as they had access to these brand new radar systems, which could pick up American stealth aircraft with ease. Not that it mattered at this point, as the USAF had been neutralized on the first day, and even within the first 5 hours of the first day, the entire USAF would be completely and thoroughly smashed on the ground, minus a select few aircraft that were even airborne at the time of the invasion's initiation. As the fighting was becoming hellish and the city resembled Berlin in 1945 in certain areas, as the strategic and tactical airstrikes, as well as artillery massed fires, were laying waste to entire districts of the city, leaving the city looking for the time being as a patchwork of relatively untouched areas versus areas that had been completely saturated thoroughly by heavy strategic air raids or massed artillery fires, huge artillery barrages, in other words. Over time, the amount of artillery fire that would be levied upon the entire city by the battle's end would leave the city as a pockmarked, cratered, rubble-strewn mess of a metro area. There would be very few parts of the city that would be left intact by the time it was all said and done. Houston was not only a major city in terms of its population, as well as also its energy industries, but it also possessed a lot of American defense contractors as well, as these defense industrial sites ranged from offices to actual plants. In general terms, the overall American defense industry was more oriented towards medium and small-sized cottage-like industries with very few major factories that were beyond 1.5 million square feet in terms of production space, with many of the factories being relatively much smaller. However, Houston had a number of defense contractors, and some of their sites included certain plants in some of the industrial parks that filled the entire Houston metro area. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Collins Aerospace, BAE USA, CACI International, RTX, KBR, SpaceX, Shield Defense Corporation, and more were all located within Houston. They all had sites, whether these, again, were offices or plants. The plants and offices both would be heavily carpet munitioned or struck by precision missile strikes from the PLA Strategic Missile Forces assets or from the naval assets of the PLAN, or the Russian VVS would carpet munition these sites and areas with their heavy strategic Tu-22M bomber squadron, which would lay waste also to enemy units in the field when they would be used in a more tactical capacity, as they would fly over and drop enormous payloads on enemy forces in certain parts of the city. Such would also be the case at the Ellington Battle. Ellington itself had played a major role in helping to mobilize the city's defenses and was now being vigorously shelled at the opening of hostilities at midnight, as it was midnight, as a mechanized infantry battalion moved in to clear a uprising cluster of armed reactionary civilians by surrounding and destroying them in a suburban housing neighborhood, while the artillery battalion materialized on a CCP regime property, an abandoned factory, and moved their artillery howitzers out and begun to fire in support of their mechanized infantry battalions, two of which would assault the Ellington Joint Base, or Ellington Field. And they would have heavy artillery support from the PLZ-05 155mm self-propelled howitzers of the 60th Combined Arms Brigade. Of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, a neighboring Combined Arms Brigade in terms of its area of operation for itself, would contribute its armored battalion also to assist in surrounding and destroying Ellington, with a single Russian Tu-22M flying over the facility and dropping a massive payload of air-to-ground, unguided, 1,000-pound munitions as it pertained to the type of each single munition that would be dropped, each weighing 1,000 pounds. They would fly over and drop massive amounts of these 1,000-pound Fab 500s, which stood for 500 kilograms, which equated to roughly just over 1,000 pounds. With the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which was a Trojan unit that was stationed itself just outside of Austin, to the east of it, where another battle was raging already at midnight, and firing some of its shorter range, albeit quite powerful, tactical ballistic missiles, with the PLAN doing its part by destroying the now dead in the water Arleigh Burke-class destroyer patrolling the littoral areas off of the coast of Houston's metro area, which included Texas City, Texas, which was now busy being captured by the PLAN Marines storming ashore, as the naval assets did their part and sunk all of the Coast Guard vessels, as well as the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, with the assistance of two Russian Su-27 fighter aircraft passing over the area, equipped with the Kibini jamming pods, which have already been tried and true against Arleigh Burke ships because it had happened to the same ship two different times in the span of years. In 2014 and again in early 2021, the Donald Cook in the Black Sea had been switched off essentially by these systems, and they were used to great effect to assist in the destruction of the Arleigh Burke ship off the coast of Texas City, Texas, by flying through the area, jamming the vessel, and allowing for the PLAN to fire their anti-ship missiles, their YJ-21s, which were extremely fast anti-ship missiles, which slammed into the side of the ship and destroyed it. And otherwise, had the Arleigh Burke not been jammed, it would have had the potential to actually fire against the missiles and try to intercept them, but this would fail because, again, the electromagnetic targeted jamming of these Kvinny systems played their role decisively. As the battle was raging now all over the city, all of the latest and greatest of the PLA's Army hardware was now out in force. When it came to their Type 99A main battle tanks that equipped the 11th and also the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade and the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, with the also quite powerful Type 96B equipping the rest of the Combined Arms Brigade's armored forces, with the close-in air defense, or their SHORAD systems, of each of the Combined Arms Brigades consisting of the SP AAA 95s, while the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade had entirely different and newer systems, again, such as the LD-35 SHORAD system, the Type 625E SHORAD system, and plus the addition of 2 battalions of HQ-16 medium-range air defense systems and HQ-22 long-range air defense systems within that brigade. As the anti-tank forces of the 83rd PLA Group Army were equipped with the extremely powerful brand new QN-506, which was not only an ace when it came to killing armored vehicles, but could also be used against clusters of infantry as well, and had an array of different types of weapon systems. Even as powerful as the AFT-10 was at extremely close range, the AFT-10 had no means by which to defend itself, as it fired the long-range and very powerful HJ-10 anti-tank missiles at a range of 6.2 miles maximum. The QN-506 was a bit different. It had autocannons and rockets and missiles and grenade launchers, among other weapons, at its disposal, and equipped the anti-tank companies within the armored battalions of these PLA Combined Arms Brigades within the 83rd PLA Group Army. The standard armored personnel carrier would be, again, the Type 89A APC, which equipped the mechanized infantry battalions and the armored infantry battalions as it pertained to their armor personnel carrier of choice, and the newest and most advanced infantry fighting vehicle, the VN-20, equipped the armored infantry and mechanized infantry platoons as their standard infantry fighting vehicle. These forces were now rampaging throughout the map as salvos of massed artillery fire from the 83rd Artillery Brigade of the PLA 83rd Group Army was firing its 155mm PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers of those artillery battalions, of the howitzer battalions, while the PHL-11s, which were the 122mm, newest iteration of the 122mm rocket artillery projectors, were firing those with the A300, longest range artillery system in the world, and most powerful, as it was a 300mm rocket, firing their 300mm rockets in support of the troops, with the Russians bringing in their extremely powerful air power with their bomber squadron of Tu-22Ms, which each carried 53,000 pounds of ordnance, and the entire bomber squadron combined carried, in conventional terms, the equivalent of 16 Hiroshima nukes, or atomic bombs, if you will. As the People's Armed Police was covering their area, moving deep into the city, they too would stop and engage a military unit in the form of the 3rd Squadron, which was a relatively well-armored squadron, of the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment. And they would not be alone. They would have very strong air support from their J-10 fighters, conducting both combat air patrols over the area's airspace, but also equipped with enough air-to-ground munitions between them to support the troops in the field. And they would be supporting these relatively light People's Armed Police paramilitary elements, as this was a standard PAP brigade and not one of their heavier light armored brigades or an artillery element, as they did have artillery regiments at their disposal, a handful of heavier brigades, but this PAP brigade was a standard PAP brigade equipped with the WZ-551, both the armored personnel carrier version, which had a machine gun turret instead of this 25mm remote controlled turret, with the infantry fighting vehicle version being that with the 25mm autocannon remote controlled turret with the 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun, and also the smoke dischargers on it as well, as can be seen. As the People's Armed Police were also equipped with their own anti-tank capabilities in the form of the man-portable HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems, they also came with an old favorite of theirs, the Type 74 flamethrower, which was a terrifying weapon to be on the receiving end of, as these forces specialized in brutal crackdowns and anti-insurgency or counterinsurgency operations, or COIN operations. They were professionals in these operations, and as a paramilitary element, they were on par with many military units and could take them on toe-to-toe with their capabilities. The People's Armed Police was China's equivalent of the Waffen-SS of World War II fame, as in a very well-armed paramilitary element equipped with heavy weapons and militarily trained and very powerful. They were the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime, of the party, if you will. They carried out the edicts of the party to the letter and never questioned their orders. They would implement the most brutal aspects of the colonization, as per Wei Fang's speech, the defense minister, who mentioned specifically that they would supplant the Americans, and the PAP would be the instrument of this policy, carrying out the brutal policies again to the letter, no questions asked. And as these were very powerful forces, as they were the equivalent of light infantry elements with their anti-tank man-portable systems, incendiary weapons, and their wheeled fighting vehicles, these forces were highly mobile and could strike quickly. And with loitering munitions support, such as the CH-901A, and of course their ISR superiority, as the PAP, PLA, and the rest of the Chinese forces and Russian forces had squad level, or even platoon level in some instances, recon drones, at the lowest level being either squad or platoon. For the PAP, it was often platoon, but there were certain PAP units that even had squad-level quadcopter recon assets, although throughout the entire PLA, every squad had a quadcopter recon asset, which mapped the battlefield in real time and fed into a central AI processing system, which also guided the AI settings on the targeting for the loitering munitions and other weapons, as well as also influencing commanders in the field. It also even aided in the angle and traverse of weapons to ensure that when weapons were utilized, they were used safely and would not result in friendly fire incidents for the troops in the field, which not only made the forces be able to perform much more safely in combat, but it also allowed for them to conduct maneuvers that were never before possible, as the ISR dominance and superiority allowed them to see everything and be able to work around everything that appeared on the real-time mapping with their combat data links and their AI system steadily feeding them the information into said combat data links. At the Ellington battle, Ellington was a installation going to the map of the Ellington battle with the 2 mechanized infantry battalions beginning to surround the area adjacent to the highway here as I-45 passed Ellington, and there was an outer ring road here in Houston that also passed through the area as well. The 2 mechanized infantry battalions attacking from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade moved into the area and quickly encircled the installation, along with the Armored Battalion moving into the area as well, waiting for the Russian heavy strategic bomber asset to move over the area and begin to drop its enormous payload at the same time as both DF-11A tactical ballistic missiles, as well as DF-15Cs, which were the bunker-busting tactical ballistic missiles, they equipped the forces of the 616th Strategic Missile Forces, their battalions. They had different battalions for several different missile varieties. They began to fire these missiles at Ellington, as installations, of course, were the prime targets of these missile forces, especially at the very beginning, before they could then shift to supporting actual troops when they made contact with enemies in the field. But for the time being, they were to strike key political targets, as in regime targets. They were to strike installations. They were to strike critical military and defense industries. They were to strike armories, logistics, and support areas, and everything. There was no safe rear area from which the Americans could mobilize anything under these types of conditions, as enemy forces appeared ubiquitously all throughout the area, and missiles and airdropped ordnance and artillery fire began to rain down on anything that could be seen that was American, as 155 shells would also contribute heavily to the bombardment, as well as the DF-11As, DF-15Cs, also sea-fired cruise missiles in the form of the YJ-18Bs from the Song-class submarines off the coast, as well as CJ-10s fired by the Renhai-class cruisers, or the Type 055 stealth cruisers that were out at sea. As they were also assisting the forces that were landing, they were also firing at targets inland as well. Going to the map, this is only the main part, the main part of the Ellington installation. There was more of it to the southwest, and there was a little bit more of it off to the west, slightly more to the north, as there was an outer road that went around, and there was a little bit more to the northeast and east, and of course again south. As a DF-15C was coming in at the opening of this map, it was hitting a bunker on this installation. The American Air Force, as again, this installation played host to 5 of the 6 American military branches. The Air National Guard, who was present here, as Ellington was home to certain Army, Guard, and Air National Guard elements, as well as Naval Reserve Forces, Coast Guard, and also Marines were here as well. The installation, the airmen were given a new TPY-4 surveillance radar that was supposedly supposed to be able to withstand certain types, frequencies of electromagnetic jamming, and it was able, at least at first, until the Cabinis came within range of it, it was able to at least see the massed air activity coming its way, but with no air defenses to speak of, now that the Arleigh Burke was engaged and destroyed immediately at the opening of hostilities, the Bttns, as they neared the area, began to jam the radar. Because it was a portable radar, it was not connected to the internet, it was not connected to the satellites, it could function working off of generator power. And these were portable buildings, and these were fortified with sandbags that were built on the outer edges of the runways. And these structures here were built specifically to house this radar. Because again, similar to what occurred along the border, due to this being a relatively close city to the coast, this was a coastal city in all sense of the word. The sea border of America needed to be surveilled, and the testing of the TPY-4 was being conducted at this facility. And it was thought that the TPY-4 could assist with doing what was being done at the border at the McAllen battle, where they tried to use the Padre Island International Airport to establish a ISR base using radar and, of course, drones there, which was horribly overrun and also cruise missiled out of existence at the opening of hostilities at that battle. Similarly occurring here, as the Bttns came into the area, there was a duel with this radar system, as in the operators that were working with this radar system, operating off of its generator power, were beginning to experience the interference from the Bttn system. And the technicians, there were also Army warrant officers here who specialized in radar repair and other types of professionals dealing with radar for Air and Army. They began to try to troubleshoot and work around the situation. And at the opening of hostilities, there were also aircraft that were airborne at the time that belonged to the different aviation assets that were actually present at this facility. As 278th ACR had moved into the area, their 4th squadron was an Aviation Sqdn. There was also the different units like the 1st of the 149th present, which was also an aviation battalion within the 36th ID, that was this installation was home to. This installation played host to the 1st of the 149th and also the 147th Attck Wing that had relocated most of its assets to the McAllen area at the Padre Island Airport, as shown and depicted in that installment of this series. However, there were still some MQ-9 Reaper drones left sitting on the taxiways of the runways at the time of the opening of hostilities. Being that the orbiting CH-4A armed reconnaissance drones, the WZ-8 stealth drones at the high altitude level, both of which were high altitude reconnaissance drones, one was armed, one was not, monitoring the area, along with now quadcopter reconnaissance assets of all the different companies comprising the 2 different mechanized infantry battalions moving in and around the installation, moving into the area to recon the area, had spotted these assets all lined up, including even a T-38, one of those trainer aircraft, as mentioned before, that was within the Shepherd Air Base battle. There was some of these present here as well, all of which were beginning to be shelled at the opening of this map and struck with DF-11s and incoming sea-fired cruise missiles. There was also a Wing Loong 2 attack drone, a specialized combat drone, out of the 20 that had been assigned to just the Houston battle. As again, before, in the previous installment, there had only been 5 of them at the Waco battle, but here were assigned a full 20 of these Wing Loong 2s, as well as also 3 CH-4A heavily armed high-altitude reconnaissance drones, which could also participate in combat if needed by the troops. The Russian Su-27s came in as well, firing their very powerful laser-guided S-25 rockets, which were relatively large air-to-ground rockets, and these were laser-guided. They were beam riding. They rode a laser line of sight into a target, which had been fired at the opening of this map at these MRAPs on the runway. As these forces were moving through the area at a frantic pace, emerging from buildings and hangars everywhere, there was total chaos and pandemonium. There were MRAPs present. Again, there were 5 of the 6 different branches present, mostly administrative personnel from the different reserve elements as well as logistical elements, as this was to become a prime logistical installation for the defense of Houston, which made it imperative for the coalition to destroy it. Hence, they sent in one of their 8 enormous Tu-22M heavy strategic bomber aircraft to lay waste to this facility, in conjunction with the Chinese missiles in the form of their DF-15C bunker-busting missiles that would hit and destroy the bunkers that lay beneath some of the hardened buildings, as well as also the DF-11As, which were coming in and hitting areas as well. These areas had already been hit by tactical ballistic missiles. These crater marks are either cruise or ballistic missile impacts, and these are tactical ballistic missile impacts. The Wing Loong 2 is firing its CM502KG anti-tank/anti-ship missiles, these potent missiles at these trucks that are trying to flee off of the outer road here that goes around the entire airstrip area, where they often have security patrols and whatnot. They had sandbagged some of the area. They had produced sandbag emplacements that went along the outer ring of the installation because, again, some installations took more precautions than did others, although the precautions were definitely not enough. They had, again, tried to turn this into a logistical facility. They had fuel trucks lined up. They had LMTVs lined up, which were the supply vehicles. Here's a bunch of LMTV trucks right here, moving through the area, trying to flee from the carpet munitioning that now is taking place. The Armored Bttn and the 2 mechanized infantry battalions at this point are surrounding the facility and beginning to break in while the heavy strategic bombing is going on by the Tu-22M, which flies over this flight path, leveling everything in its path, destroying all of it. This truck is on the outer blast radius and gets destroyed, gets wiped out, just thrown like it weighs nothing. These troops are KIA'd. This group of troops is KIA'd. This building's already gutted at the opening of the map, because at the opening of the map, this is where the bomber's present at the opening of the map. It was steady moving through the area quickly. This is gutted at the opening of the map, but will be completely leveled as indicated by it being surrounded in blue. These trucks will be completely leveled. These end up getting hit from a distance by tank shells, Frag T tank shells. They don't even waste the heat shells on these LMTVs. They just fire the Frag T tank shells, blast these LMTVs from a distance, as the armor is sitting right outside the fencing that goes around this facility, just a chain link fence. That's why they tried to begin to build sandbags, and they also were beginning to add portable buildings, tents, and a machine gun emplacement to guard their installation, because again, certain installation commanders took certain precautions while others did not. It was all based on the individual redcon status of each and every installation. And this was not an active duty military installation by any means. However, it was critically important to the National Guard of both the Air National Guard and the Army Guard, because a lot of aviation assets were located here. A lot of Apache attack helicopters, Chinook helicopters. This is a Chinook that was in the air at the time of the opening of the hostilities at midnight. This battle begins shortly after midnight, when the air power arrives flying over the coast and entering the Houston metro area with this bomber aircraft dropping enormous payloads here on this installation right away. This battle begins literally 15 minutes after midnight. This Chinook, these 2 Blackhawks, these 5 Apaches that were unarmed, by the way. They were not armed at the time, but they were airborne. They were doing practice flights along with these other helos. They're all swatted down by FN-16 missiles, which were basically a more advanced version of the FN-6 short-range air defense missile, fired from 4 miles away, coming from the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Battalion's short-range air defense right here outside of Ellington. They moved here into the airport early on right away, and they left a battery of their battalion to fire in support of these forces moving into the area, because these were the air defense artillery battalions that comprised the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade. And these were the 2 mechanized infantry battalions assaulting the installation with the armored battalion from the 113th. These 2 came from the 60th, which is these battalions here. As they came in, and the air power, which was overwhelming, also came in with these Su-27s firing their 30mm nose cannons at the ground as well, as they fire each 2 of their S-25 laser-guided rockets. Chinese artillery is coming in, as indicated by these imminent strike markers. These are current strikes at the opening of the map of 155 artillery strikes just pounding this area along the runway, where there had been different types of aviation assets, from training jet aircraft to drones to helos. This base was crowded at the time because, again, they were in the process of transforming this into a logistical facility to support the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment right here, who was now deployed throughout different locations in the city at different bivouac sites that were leased by the state and federal regime, and logistics would need to be brought out to them. Food, fuel, ammunition, water, spare parts, maintenance, POL products, everything. They would need a logistical facility to support all these units that were now spread out to strategically protect vital interests in the city. And now, everything was being laid waste to. It would now be up to the local logistical forces in each and every area, as it pertained to the headquarters platoons of each company and each support element at the larger level, whether it was the support battalion of the 278th or other types of logistical elements. As this installation, which would be filled to the brim with logistics as it was intended, would be completely smashed by the strategic air raid, the air strikes. These were tactical airstrikes coming in to strike certain enemy forces, with the air defense forces firing, the Chinese air defense forces firing their FN-16 air defense missiles to swat down all these helos that were trying now to get out of the area to save their helos, because they saw what was already going on. They saw the heavy strategic bomber landing all these massive blows on their facility, as this bomber was many thousands of feet in the air. I mean, they couldn't necessarily see it, of course, from their helo, but when the bombs landed, they saw that, and they were trying to get the hell out of there. Missile strikes were coming in as well from the sea-based YJ-18s, and also from the subs, which were these, and also CJ-10s, which could be fired from the Ren High class, would be coming in as well. This is a CJ-10 coming in to strike this area that's encircled. This is a cruise missile strike. Also, the DF-11A is coming in to strike this even larger area right here. That's why this arrow's encapsulated in red. This one's encapsulated in red. All these panic forces are trying to flee the area as artillery strikes and missile strikes are coming in. Drone strikes, tactical air strikes and strafing. I mean, the PLA troops coming in with their VN-20s of each platoon, along with their Type 89A armored personnel carriers with the heavy machine guns, they're laying down heavy fire, 100mm fire, 30mm autocannon fire, 7.62 by 54mm coax fire from the VN-20s. Also, the HJ-12E anti-tank missiles that are on each side of the VN-20, as such, protected by ERA or NERA plating, and could fire them out of these protected rail systems, and were very destructive, of course, against armored vehicles. These were just MRAPs. They had no chance against the 30mm autocannon, much less the 100mm main gun, or even the anti-tank weapons, and they were just being annihilated. And the mechanized infantry forces, as each battalion, of course, had its own fire support company with PLL-05 dual assault gun / mortars, which were 120mm, as well as 2 firing platoons, 1 platoon of PLL-05s, 2 firing platoons of 130mm Type 63 multiple launch rocket systems, which are light artillery and short range. These fire support companies were firing to support their troops, now smashing through the fencing and entering the badly gutted installation after having been pounded by Chinese artillery strikes, missile strikes, and more incoming, as these forces would temporarily pause right here so as to not be completely hit by friendly fire, as these cruise missile strikes, artillery strikes, tactical ballistic missile strike, which is massive in this area right here, as well as also the enormous strategic air raid coming through. These tanks wouldn't even move in until after the bomber had safely passed, as it laid waste to this entire area. All these arrows encapsulated by blue are all these troops running in these different directions. Buildings in blue mean they're totally destroyed. Everything encapsulated in blue is totally destroyed by the strategic air raid. The only reason these were destroyed was because, again, the Frag T shells came in and hit them before at the same time as the bomber was passing. So the shells got these, and the bomber just annihilated the wreckage. And these were all, of course, saturated at the opening of the map by the outer blast radius. The forces trying to run out of the way here, they all get caught up in it. The multiple launch light artillery rockets are slamming into this field right here, which are the 130mm rockets, and are annihilating these individual troops, along with a 120mm mortar strike from the PLL-05 hitting right here. Some of these guys temporarily got away, but they would end up getting annihilated by the carpet munitioning flying over this area. So with these portable buildings, machine gun nests, this tent right here, all these troops up here running by the sandbags near the outer fence, which is a bit off the map, they're going to get annihilated. All of this stuff gets completely destroyed. This had already been hit by a tactical ballistic missile, a DF-11A hit here from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which is firing the DF-11As and the DF-15Cs, the bunker busters. These mechanized infantry troops are moving into the area from right here, along with their vehicles waiting and sitting back as mobile fire support platforms. Not that they would be needed as such, because many of these troops were now running from the artillery strikes and were getting intercepted. Even though they had some of the men that were armed were opening fire against these vehicles, it did nothing to the vehicles, and the vehicles laid down heavy machine gun fire on the fleeing troops. And the small arms fire from these troops just cut them down in waves. This rolling T moving through the area, as they had already cleared these buildings before forming up into a rolling T. They were going to come across here, but then were informed that a DF-11A was coming down to hit this and destroy it, which is a massive area right here. That's a massive radius. And these buildings, of course, are all encapsulated in red because they get destroyed by the incoming tactical ballistic missile. This is all in red because the ballistic missile strike ring is right here. This is hit in blue and red from the strafing and rocket fire and the Russian and Chinese fire. Mortar strikes, everything just being saturated, annihilated in this area. I mean, the outer range, I mean, the munitions going off just leveled this building right here. And these were on the outer edges, these LMTV trucks. They were just gone. They were just blown and flipped over and destroyed. And mortar strike right there. Air defense missiles flew in, the FN-16s from the short-range air defense assets of the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, their SHORAD battalions, one of which was equipped with the Type 625Es, the other being equipped with the LD-35s, which are both very new, very advanced short-range air defense systems, and they were firing the new versions of the FN-6s, which were the FN-16s, which were, they could do 18G turns. I mean, they were highly maneuverable missiles. They could follow helos easily, and they swatted them all down as the incoming naval-fired cruise missile strikes hit right here. They destroyed the radar, basically, with Chinese artillery 155 strikes, hit this area where the radar was, got all the troops. Incoming cruise missile strike annihilates this entire setup where they had their TPY-4 radar that they were trying out, and the portable buildings that go with it, essentially, that had all the equipment and the specialists working in these buildings. There was another portable building set up. This was all to be a logistical area right here, and it all was destroyed. The drone ended up destroying these trucks fleeing from the outer range road there that goes around the outer airfield road that goes around the airfield. They were fleeing the area. They got hit by the CM502KGs fired by the combat drone, the Wing Loong 2. This was a highly savage and destructive and very rapid operation, with the troops smashing their way in through the outer fencing right after the heavy strategic bomber moved through the area, right after the DF-11As and DF-15Cs struck their targets, and the cruise missile strikes hit theirs here and here, as the CJ-10 was coming in from the Ren High class, and the YJ-18Bs from the submarines, the Song class subs, which were fully capable of firing the YJ-18B sub-launched cruise missiles, which hit right here. And both the YJ-18B strike here and the strike from the CJ-10 hit the same thing, with the DF-11A coming in, hitting this and destroying this massive area, with these forces staying back and getting in the prone position, because that's danger close. Even though they were safely outside of the blast radius, the main blast radius, it was still relatively danger close, so they got down and prone and prepared for impact, as they had a combat data link that told them everything that was going on. Communications were steady. ISR was everywhere. Their quadcopter recon assets all the way to their high altitude assets. They were seeing everything at all times. The AI was processing all the combat data and assisting them in making all their fluid and rapid decision-making on the battlefield. And the integration of even foreign allies working together was absolute, as the Russian and Chinese AI systems could cooperate with one another, and they could easily communicate through their combat data links and their ISR networks, as they could patch into each other's networks. As this technology absolutely exists, and China and Russia absolutely possess it. And it is being used in this hypothetical invasion documentary series. These troops taking cover in the rubble, wedge formation moving up through these rubble buildings, already hit and destroyed by artillery by the time these guys had moved in, these mechanized infantry troops from the two different mech infantry battalions surrounding the area, as their fire support companies of each of the two battalions fire their PLL-05s and lay waste to enemy forces, as well as their 130mm rocket strikes, just annihilating enemies, with the air defense knocking down the helos, tactical, ballistic, and also cruise missiles from the sea launch platforms coming in, Russian tactical airstrikes from their fighters firing their limited air-to-ground munitions and their nose cannons, as they're mostly equipped with air-to-air munitions, and the heavy strategic bomber, the Tu-22M, one of the 8 of the squadron, laying waste to much of this installation, before at the very last move, the tank company, one of the tank companies of the 4 tank companies out of the Armored Bttn, as it had also 2 armored infantry companies, which are mech infantry, the one with their Armored Bttn, and also an anti-tank company of the brand new QN506s, the anti-tank vehicles, latest and greatest of the anti-tank vehicles of the PLA, and also their headquarters company and support company. They sent in one of their tank companies to clear the area after The Tu-22M had passed through, and after the tactical ballistic missiles and sea-based cruise missile strikes had done their damage, along with the artillery strikes that came in and just pummeled this place to oblivion. Much of this already destroyed. Some of the buildings were still intact, but not very many by the time it was all over. All these would end up being annihilated. But they would capture the airstrip relatively intact with damage, but they would be repairable. And then they would begin to convert this into their own FOB later, as the American logistics base had now come to an end, as that was what Ellington was to become. It was to become the logistical center, as it had an airfield for the operations to defend the city of Houston and its metro area. Within moments, within under an hour, all of this came to a rapid end. Even as the Marines were busy capturing Texas City, Texas, this battle had ended much earlier than even theirs had. And there were still many other battles occurring during this opening phase of hostilities from 12 a.m. and onward. This began at 12:15 a.m., whereas at 12 a.m. prompt, the missile fire, artillery fire, and the beginning of mass movements off CCP properties had begun. Next battle is the People's Armed Police movement against and into the city against the 3rd Squadron of the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment in the next installment of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines.